welcome to the lecture series in computer science. We are seeing a series of lectures in the subject Agile Methodologies. We will be seeing a topic on Agile Documentation. As the contents of the session are, we will be seeing the need for Agile Documentation, the practices for increasing agility in the Agile Documentation, and documentation through user stories. How do you get it? What is a user story and how to document the user story, and that we will be seeing. And then we will be seeing about the communication modes and documenting options. As well, we will be seeing the strategy that is to be followed for Agile documentation. Now, what is the need for Agile documentation? Why do we require Agile documentation? My dear viewers, you might be aware that as far as the Agile software development process model is concerned, we will be using only very minimal documentation. We will not be going in for a very large documentation as we do it for the traditional development model. So, in Agile development, we know that it is a pretty small documentation. Wherever it is needed, only in those places we will be doing the documentation part. So, let us see where are the places wherein the documentation is needed, and let us have a look at the need for Agile documentation. The Agile documentation is an approach to create concise documents that serve the situation at hand. Agile documents have a specific customer and facilitate the work efforts of that customer. The system documentation is typically written for maintenance developers, providing an overview of the system's architecture and potentially summarizing critical requirements and design decisions. So, only in these places we go in for this Agile documentation. Now, let us see the best practices for increasing the agility in documentation. So, when do you think the agility will increase? Agility means swiftness, rapidness. So, let us see some of the best practices. First practice is said to be in writing. We prefer executable specifications over static documents to document stable concepts and not speculative ideas. Generating system documentation. If we get a very clear fledged requirements, then we will be documenting it. Supposing if the idea is said to be somewhat speculative, we do not document it. And then the second best practice is said to be simplification. We keep the documentation just as simple enough but not too simple. We follow a small formula which is called as keep it short and simple. It is called as, in short, it is called as KISS. So, keep it short and simple. Similarly, here also we use this keep documentation just simple enough but not too small. Then the next point is to write the fewest documents with least overlap. Put the information in the most appropriate place. Display the information publicly. And then the next practice is said to be in terms of determining what to document. Documents should be done. It should have a purpose. Focus on the needs of the actual customers of the document. The customer determines sufficiency. So, these are some of the best practices for increasing the agility in documentation. Then, determining when to document. We have seen what to document. Now, let us see when to document. Iterate, iterate, iterate. The more and more we iterate, the more and more features that we get, the more and more we document. Find better ways to communicate. Start with models you actually keep. Update only when it hurts, only when it requires. Then the general practice that we follow is treat documentation like a requirement. Require people to justify documentation requests. Recognize that you need some documentation. Get someone with a writing experience. So, even in Agile model, my dear viewers, apart from the team, you need to exclusively appoint a person to take care of the documentation part, to take care of whatever is needed. Only those things have to get documented. So, a person should be fixed with an experience, so that he will be in a position to recognize what are the things that are needed for the documentation. Then the next is, let us have a comparative analysis, a graphical analysis between documentation part with respect to the traditional model and the documentation part with respect to the agile model. So let us have a graphical structure, so that, as my dear viewers, as you know, a picture is worth more than 1000 words. So if it is being represented pictorially, you will be in a position to understand it in a better way. Now this red line determines the traditional model, and this green line determines the agile model. My dear viewers, you might be knowing the agile documentation has a minimal set of documentation. So wherein you document late, which means one and only if a feature has been developed, you document based on the feature alone. Now as far as the red line, as far as the traditional model is concerned, we plan for the documentation for a detail. We have a detailed project plan, we create a detailed requirement specification, and in traditional software development lifecycle model, you would have studied this concept in a subject called software engineering. Such a documentation, you call it as the software requirement specification documentation, which is in short called as an SRS documentation. So that you do in a traditional model. You have a detailed project plan, you maintain a detailed requirement specification, you maintain a detailed design specification. So before going into the coding phase itself, you maintain these many documents, and then after completing the coding, you maintain a support documentation, operations documentation, and the user manuals, the user catalogs. User manuals are nothing but the catalogs. So these documentations you maintain as far as the traditional model is concerned. Now let us see the documentation part as far as an agile model is concerned. So this graph is exclusively divided into two halves. One is called as time, x axis denotes time, y axis denotes the effort. So here in agile documentation, we do not do the initial documentation at all. We start the documentation one and only when we start developing a feature. So we give the first documentation will be the system overview documentation. When we generate the system overview documentation, at this juncture, here in traditional model, they would have gone in completing the support documentation, operation documentation, user documentation. So when we create this system overview documentation, and from this system overview documentation, we will in turn we will write few points for this user documentation, because the user manual is pretty important. After the software gets delivered to the user, the manual only reflects of what has been done. So in that case, after creating the system overview documentation only, we go in for this user documentation. So this is the major difference between a traditional documentation model and the agile documentation model. Now let us see how to see a documentation through user stories. My dear viewers, you would have known about user stories. When we speak about the one of the framework called as Scrum framework, we had seen a Scrum board. The Scrum board is also called as a storyboard. The storyboard is also called as a task board. So here that storyboard or the Scrum board, in the Scrum board you would have seen many different sticky notes being placed in it. So each and every sticky note is called as a separate user story. So in the user story, so how do I make documentation, how do I create documentation? Just by having a user story. Is that as I will be writing only 3 different lines. From the user story, I will be picking only 3 different lines. The first line will state as a user role. What is the role? I am a product owner, I am a developer, I am a tester, I am a team member, I am a scrum master. So what role you play? That specifies this as a user role. Then what is the goal? What you are trying to achieve? What do you want to figure out from this particular user story that you have picked out? That specifies the goal. So I want this thing to be achieved. So that specifies the goal. The third point, so that if I am going to achieve this goal, what is the benefit? What are the features? what are the incremental delivery I will be in a position to give. So that benefit you need to specify. So my dear viewers, this documentation through user stories has only 3 points: as a user role, I want, this goal, and the benefit. And these 3 points are highly required as far as the examination point of view is concerned. So kindly have it in your mind as a reminder. Then the next is, we will see what do you write in a technical documentation. The documentation as far as the agile software development model is concerned, it is broadly classified into 2 types. One is called as technical documentation, other one is called as the functional documentation. So now let us see what are the contents that are required for a technical documentation. Here let us make a comparative analysis with respect to the framework Scrum. So here in this you have the release. As far as Scrum framework is concerned, how do we work with the Scrum framework? We work based on sprints. What do we deliver at the end of each and every sprint? We deliver small minimum marketable features. Supposing if you are going to combine this XP model with respect to your Scrum framework, Scrum is said to be a project management approach. XP, extreme programming, is said to be a technical model. So when you are going to mix and match both the technical model and the project management approach, both extreme programming and Scrum, then in extreme programming we call those releases as small releases, small incremental deliveries. So here in Scrum we call, after sprint we call it as the minimum marketable features, so which is classified into each and every sprint. So at the end of each and every sprint we are supposed to deliver a small feature. So when a feature has been delivered, what do? We update the design and we create a document, and we name the document as document A. When one other feature, if it has been created in the same sprint, we update the design, we create a document called document B. So this is what we do in sprint 1. Then when we move on to this sprint 2, here in the sprint 2, supposing there are any backlogs in sprint 1, supposing if any product backlog has been placed in the parking lot, then my dear viewers, you might be aware of the sprint backlog, product backlog, parking lot. Supposing if any backlogs are being available placed in the sprint backlog, and if you are going to take those backlogs into the next sprint, and if we try to fix the backlogs, clear the issues, then we create it as, we fix the bugs. So when the bugs are fixed, a new feature is developed. When the new feature is developed, then we update the design documentation A, as well we update the design documentation B. So because, why do we want to update both these design documentations? Because these new features are interlinked, so we update the documents. Similarly, we go in for the next sprint. So in the next sprint we develop a new feature. So we combine all those design documents, all those updated design doc A, doc B, then we create a exclusive documentation, that we do it in the sprint 4. So we deliver the design documentation A, we deliver the design documentation B, we deliver the release notes. Release notes determine, these things are design doc A and design doc B determines what are the features in which you have added, how you have fixed the errors, how you have cleared the bugs. But here this release notes will exclusively specify what you have, like when you are going to release a new feature, what does that new feature will do, what does that new small releases will do. So those things will be given in this release notes. So that is delivered as a separate documentation. So then when it is being delivered, when we are going to release this release notes, then it is called as the release, and the overall content we call it as DOD in short. DOD determines definition of done, wherein in this sprint you will be provided with the document contents. During the release we will be giving the document delivery. So this is how the technical documentation is prepared as far as an agile software development is concerned. Then now let us see how a model gets converted into a document, how a document, from the document, how it is been taken into the source code, from the source code overall how it becomes as a documentation. So from the model, this model speaks about the design part. We are going to develop a prototype, a small prototype, then it may become or be part of a document, and this prototype we will be enhancing the prototype. Where do we do this? We do this in evolutionary prototyping model. In an evolutionary prototyping model is built based on the existing prototype. We keep on building the more and more contents, and we make it as an evolutionary prototype model. So this model may describe the source code. So and this model will be part of the document. Document is nothing but it is documentation. So this documentation will describe the contents available in the source code, and in turn it will speak about the model. This source code will be part of this entire documentation. This is the basic comparative similarities between a model which becomes a document, the document, and these are the relationship between model, document, code and the documentation. Then next is, let us see about the communication modes and the documentation options. In the earlier days, my dear viewers, when you have worked with a traditional software development life cycle model, you would have had a comprehensive documentation, a very big pages together documentation, a very big scripts being placed in front of you as documentation. Whereas in agile we have a very minimal documentation. In traditional model, when you have it in pages together, in those days people used to write, they write it in pages, but nowadays we have many different options. Apart from writing, even we have the software such as WhatsApp, where apart from typing your messages, what do? You make a audio recording and you send the audio recording to them, or else you take a video shoot and then you send it across to them. You make a live streaming. So everything at one particular juncture, everything will become a documentation, and this audio recording and video recordings will be more than the paper written documentations. So here let us see what are the communication modes and the documentation options. So this y-axis speaks about the communication effectiveness, x-axis speaks about the way you communicate, the channel for communication, the richness of communication channels. So my dear viewers, in olden days, this is the olden days wherein we documented with respect to paper and pen. So you had the paper documentation, and then what are the other documentation options available as on date I said? We have the audio tapes, email conversations, video tapes, and that is the reasons many of the organizations, they ask you people to just you type in the mail, whatever you communicate, whatever you converse, it should be only through mail. It is because at one point of juncture, supposing if you have made any mistakes, they will be in a position to track the old conversations. So that is the reason of an email conversation, that becomes a documentation. So video tapes is one other documentation, and these four things are said to be the documentation options. My dear viewers, This is an examination point of view question as well an interview point of view question, wherein when people ask you about the documentation options, one, we need to say it as a paper, second audio tape, third email conversation, fourth is the video tape. Then now let us see the modeling options. We have phone conversation. Nowadays whomsoever speaks over the phone. Few people have a habit of recording it, and few people have a habit of sending that recorded voice to one other people. So phone conversation is one of the modeling option. The second option is to be video conversation. When people speak among themselves, few people have a habit of having a hidden camera. Few people might not be knowing that their voice is being recorded, that their picture is being recorded. So you have video conversation. Then you have a face-to-face conversation. On the face-to-face communication, face-to-face conversation, and face-to-face at whiteboard. What is it, whiteboard? Supposing if you make any mistakes, supposing if we both are working on a same project, on a same module of a project, and if I am not able to understand a particular concept, and if there is a whiteboard, what you will do? You will try to draw the diagrams and then show it to me, so that pictorially if you are going to draw it, I will be in a position to easily understand the contents. So face to face at whiteboard. So these four things happen to be called as the modeling options. What are the four things? I repeat, it is phone conversation, video conversation, face to face conversation, and face to face at whiteboard. So these are the different communication modes and the documentation option. So this is highly important as far as any interview point of view is concerned. Then let us see the effectiveness of communicating modes and the documentation options with respect to the different team structure. My dear viewers, in our earlier lectures we have seen about the different team structures. We have an in-house team, we have a co-located team, and then we have a distributed team. What do you mean by in-house team? In-house team is a team which works in the same organization, in the same building. Co-located team is a team who also work in the same organization, but their office, a few people will be working in the same office, few team members will be working in an office which is somewhere 10 kilometers ahead. Few people will be working in a different office which will be somewhere around 20 kilometers apart from this particular office. But if you are going to call all of them for a face-to-face discussion, definitely everyone will be in a position to gather at a common center point, because everyone is at the radius of either of 10 kilometer or at the radius of 20 kilometer distance. So such team you call it as a co-located team. And what is a geographically distributed team, or it is also called as a geographically distant team? Geographically distributed team is a team member, one person will be working in Chennai, the second person, the second team will be working in New Delhi, the third team will be working in Melbourne, the fourth team will be working in Ethiopia. So it is very difficult to make everyone to come on a face-to-face discussion. Rather we will have only a sort of video conferencing, and when a team working in Ethiopia and when one other team working in Melbourne, you will be having a cultural difference, you will be having a racial difference, you will be having a time difference. So mapping, calling each and every team to a single point and to convene a meeting becomes a very difficult option. So let us see the effectiveness of communicating modes and documentation options as far as these particular teams are concerned. One is, for anyone and everyone, we have the detailed documentation, and then we have the audio recording, then we have video recordings, we have overview documentation, we have digital snapshot, we have email, online chat conversation. So this persistence is required. Only for that reason I have given it as persistence required. And then if it is a geographically distant team, we need to have phone conversation, we need to have video conferencing. And if it is of a co-located team, we have face-to-face conversation, face-to-face around shared sketching environment. Then all these things are said to be most effective, and when we are going to have a detailed documentation, it is least effective. So when you are going to have all these things, it becomes most effective. So this is an effectiveness of communicating modes and documenting options. Then, so next is, let us see the simple guidelines in creating agile documentation. You work with executable specifications. Document as late as possible. You simplify the documentation. Avoid overlapping documents. Purpose oriented documents are to be created, and you need to use the agile documentation tools. There are certain tools available, Jira, Mingle, version 1. With the help of those tools, it is easy to create documentation. That is called as an agile documentation, usage of agile documentation tools. Now let us see, we have seen about the two different documentation, technical documentation and functional documentation. So let us see what we are going to do with respect to the three different phases. One is pre-project documentation, during project documentation, post-project or the maintenance documentation. So here, as far as the pre-project documentation is concerned, as far as the technical documentation is concerned, 2 or 3 high-level architecture diagrams are drawn of our choice. And then as far as during the design project, during the project documentation is concerned, well structured code which is readable by non-technical people, which is understandable by non-technical people, also should be documented, and non-technical elements. And we have a test driven document, and we have a behavior driven document. Behavior driven document, my dear viewers, you would have studied again in a subject called software engineering, wherein we would have studied a part called black box testing, wherein the structure of code, the internal structure of code will not be given to you, only the working of the software will be known to you. So, and when you test it, such a testing you call it as a behavior testing, and such a driven development we call it as a behavior driven development, and code as documentation. So, and then during the maintenance phase we code as technical documentation, and this is what we do for technical. As far as the functional documentation is concerned, as far as the pre-project documentation is concerned, main epics, identifying the main characteristics of the product to develop. So main epics denote, my dear viewers, I said the user stories are splitted, like the very big story you call it as an epic, and those splitted stories we called as the user story. So that main epics are identified as the main characteristics of the product to develop, and it gets split into the user stories. Then one user story at a time has to get developed. So user stories with well defined unambiguous acceptance criteria as documentation, and then as a maintenance part we code as the living documentation. So this is what we do. And then finally let us see the strategy of agile documentation. It improves the documentation capabilities, it plans and measures the work, and then it is used to reduce the amount of documentation required, and then it reduces the effort required to produce documentation, and you can very well browse the net to get even more contents. It improves document, and this is a very important interview point of a question. The strategy of agile documentation, it improves documentation capabilities, plan and measure the work, it reduces the amount of documentation required, it reduces the effort required to produce documentation. Now let us summarize this session. We saw about the need for agile documentation, the practices for increasing agility in documentation. We saw about the documentation writing through user stories. We saw the different communication modes and the documenting options. We saw about the strategies that are to be followed for agile documentation. Thank you.